Happy Halloween, all you cinema drunks. With Halloween approaching, let's take a look back at the making of the soundtracks and films of three of Ben's favorite horror movies. On this episode of Scream and Vinyl.
There's a really nice parallel between the two facets of this film that I'm going to discuss. On one hand, the film Return of the Living Dead has a very steep hill to climb as a film. Coming out in 1985, it's easy to say that zombies weren't exactly topping the popularity charts when it came to horror. We were far past the groundbreaking George Romero revolutionary classic Night of the Living Dead, and almost 20 years away from the films that reinvigorated the genre, like 28 Days Later, the Dawn of the Dead remake, and of course, Shaun of the Dead. Zombie movies were the lowest common denominator, the bottom of the barrel, the forgotten era. People turned their heads to them, threw their noses up in the air at them. Long story short, they were not respected. As if all this wasn't enough to sink the movie, add in punk rock music, a completely repulsive, loud, and downright ignored music genre of the time, at least in the States. Sure, there were many great punk bands making waves in the early 80s, but when it came to Hollywood, it wasn't exactly the type of music you would load up a movie soundtrack with. Yes, there was the strong era where we saw the beginning of the New York punk rock scene from 1974 to 1981 with acts like Patti Smith and the New York Dolls, but by 1985, it was all but passed up by the Michael Jacksons and Talking Heads of the time. Still, punk rock influenced a ton of the music that would come in the following decades. When it reached the West Coast, it came in the form of your Black Flags, Dead Kennedys, Circle Jerks, TSOL, and Bad Religions. During this time, growing underneath the surface was psychobilly, sometimes called horrorbilly, which was a fusion of rockabilly, goth rock, and at the forefront, punk rock. A recipe bred perfectly for horror. So with both the genre of the film and the music chosen for the film having not been ever mainstream at that point, director Dan O'Bannon was said to be out of his mind for taking on the project. Opening up fairly wide against both National Lampoon's European Vacation and the juggernaut that was Back to the Future, which was #1 at the box office for 11 weeks that summer. Return opened up, well, really strong. It opened to $4.5 million, which was more than its entire budget. It went on to gross just over $14 million. A really good hit, especially for its R rating, which at one point was almost going to receive an X for its sex, nudity, violence, gore, intense sequences, and profanity. I mean, Lena Quigley is fully naked for basically the entire movie, even after becoming a zombie. Spoilers. Aside from becoming a big hit by 1980s horror standards, it was always a bigger critical sensation. It currently holds a 91% on Rotten Tomatoes, who stated, "A punk take on the zombie genre, Return of the Living Dead injects a healthy dose of 1980s silliness to the flesh-consuming." Though I tend to agree with the quote, I question the validity of Rotten Tomatoes in general. The film's legacy as not only a great zombie horror film, but also as a classic punk soundtrack is cemented in the culture for which it stems from. It has influenced horror films since its release, but also punk bands. The since disbanded British horrorbilly band Send More Paramedics took their name from the film.
Send more paramedics.
Performing their shows dressed as zombies and singing lyrics mostly referencing zombie films. The film was originally shot in 1:8:5:1 and audio recorded in mono. There have been several remasterings since, but from what I hear, some of them pull a George Lucas and mess with not only the music in the film, but change the pitch of some of the zombies' voices, including the film's MVP, Tarman. It wasn't just the music of the film that was punk rock. It was even ballsier of O'Bannon to write the majority of the main cast protagonists as punks. We have characters named Suicide, Trash, Scuzz, and Spider. So in a way, the whole fucking movie is punk rock. So it was only fitting to add in some great punk music. O'Bannon directed the film as well as wrote the screenplay, based off a story by John Russo, who wrote the novel that it's loosely based on. O'Bannon got his start working with the legendary John Carpenter, who he went to USC Film School with, and they worked on the film Dark Star together. He made his early living as a script doctor, and even wrote a few stories for Heavy Metal magazine. He was brought on to doctor the script for Return of the Living Dead, that at the time was slated to be directed by Tobe Hooper, who eventually had to back out because of obligations to direct Life Force. So O'Bannon was offered the duties, which he happily accepted. Once he was on board, a lot of changes were made to the original Russo draft. Apparently, Russo's script was a much more serious take on the material, which was believed to be a direct sequel to Night of the Living Dead. However, by the time O'Bannon was done with it, it had almost zero resemblance to the original story and novel, particularly a scene where a character, Frank, tells his new assistant the story of the events of the original Night of the Living Dead in an honorary attempt to link the two films together, if nothing more than to pay homage.
Let me ask you a question, kid. Did you see that movie, Night of the Living Dead?
Yeah. That's the one where the corpses start eating the people, right?
The film is considered one of the best zombie movies ever made, and I would have to agree. Not because it's super scary or intense, even though it is, more because it's the funnest time you will ever have watching a zombie movie where the world is about to end. It's self-contained, yes, but there's an underlining current that everything around the crazy, goofy hijinks that's going on, that much more of the world is in danger. It's undercut by the fun for which the film is approached, but it's there nonetheless. And the complete badass punk music plays a huge part in that.
Ooh, baby, your asphalt eater hung 10. The Hodads and Grammy say you reach top, answer to the dead.
This film is chocked full of great psychobilly tracks. Bud Carr, one of the industry's top talents in music supervision at the time, was recruited to work on with O'Bannon, and what they put together just made the film that much better. Carr would go on to become a very big name within the industry, becoming a frequent collaborator with Academy Award winner Oliver Stone on such films like Platoon, JFK, The Doors, Born on the 4th of July, Natural Born Killers, and Any Given Sunday. Later in his career, he supervised the music for the underrated Rockstar and Get On Up, starring the late Chadwick Boseman. Carr and his team had only $10,000 and 2 weeks to put the soundtrack together. Bands that he already knew to be aficionados of the subgenre, like the Cramps, were easy picks. However, the song to open the film had to be so perfect that it had to fill out the music for a fairly long opening credit sequence and set the tone of the rest of the movie. Enter the main title by Francis Haynes, the Trioxin Theme. The Cramps' Surfin' Dead, which first lays down the perfect Halloween dose of slow drum, is immediately ripped into with the late singer Lux Interior's ghoulish lyrics, "Aw, my favorite brain soup."
My favorite brain soup.
That's then followed with guitarist Poison Ivy's dark, gothy guitar riff. The song is the movie, with the chorus line being, "Come on, do the dead." It helps feed to the audience exactly what type of movie this really is. And it plays very much like your classic Halloween song from the 50s or 60s, only it's punk rock, and it's in a crazy fucking movie. This movie doesn't give a fuck. That's the best way to describe it, and the song tells that tale. 45 Graves, Party Time, definitely more of a hair metal song, but again, Carr knows exactly what its use is, and it shreds in the moment it's used for. 45 Grave formed in 1979 and actually broke up the same year this movie was released. Hopefully there was no correlation. One of the more punkier of the punk songs on the punk soundtrack has to go to the Damned's track Deadbeat Dance, another track that fits the tone of the film oh so perfectly. The Damned are an English rock band formed in London in 1976 and were the first major Brit punk band to tour the United States. Badass guitar player Captain Sensible actually left the band soon after the film's release, saying that the band was going too much in the gothic genre, which he apparently didn't like. They later became renounced for their gothic-style punk rock, so clearly Captain Sensible had a point. TSOL's Nothing For You didn't speak to the movie directly like some of the other ones did, but it's still one of the most punk rock tracks on the record. From Long Beach and formed in 1978, TSOL considered themselves in various genres of music, including death rock, art punk, and horror punk. Perfect for this soundtrack.
What do you think this is all about? You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
The best actual tried and true punk track on the album is the Flesh Eaters' Eyes Without a Face. This song is awesome. It's fun, it's fast, and it's fucking punk rock as fuck. Formed in Los Angeles in 1977 by punk poet Chris Desjardins, their music was distinctive for its apocalyptic film noir lyricism and its sophisticated arrangements. The band was much smarter than history gives them credit for. They were at their height in the mid-80s, so they were a given to be recruited for this film soundtrack. Every track on the record evokes the sense and fun of the film. It's crazy fun through and through. There's not a dull moment in this movie, and the music keeps it crazy and exciting. There's so many wonderful, crass, and deliberate moments in this movie that are all aided by the music that Carr set up for it. This movie, it's funny. It's a fucking funny movie.
Hold him down now, hold him down. What are you gonna do? Yeah, man.
Leanne Quigley, aka Trash, does an awesome naked dance in a graveyard to her own self-titled theme, SSQ, and it's 80s glorious. I know these days that scene probably wouldn't exist, but in 1985, it was fun and wacky and amazing. I actually love the direction horror has taken, but films like James Gunn's Slither really stand out because they evoke the same sensibilities of something like Return of the Living Dead. And it also created so many of the zombie tropes that people think of from earlier zombie movies, like eating brains. What I also love is it just doesn't follow a certain set of rules. The zombies, yeah, they run, they talk, they think shit out, and plan. So fucking what? It's a glorious piece of horror filmmaking, and the music has become more than just cult classic. I would think that modern-day horror directors could only dream of catching the same fun, scares, gore, and grip of the zeitgeist of the genre. The original soundtrack from the film of the same name, released in 1985 by Enigma Records. The soundtrack has undergone numerous releases in different countries. A limited Grey Brains edition vinyl was released in 2016. You can find the original pressings on Discogs, and the 2016 Grey Brains edition pressings supposedly on Amazon, but they may be all out of stock.
For my Halloween vinyl recommendation, going a little different this time. I'm going with A Horn Book for Witches. It's a bunch of ghost stories told by Vincent Price.
A Horn Book for Witches.
When a vampire buys it, it's never a pretty sight. No two bloodsuckers go out the same way. Some yell and scream, some go quietly. Some explode, some implode.
The 1980s gave us so many popular coined movie catchphrases that one finds it hard to count. I'll be back. Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker. I'm too old for this shit. But my personal favorite has always been...
Holy shit! It's the Attack of Eddie Munster!
Probably not as well known, but nonetheless iconic. Released on July 31st, 1987 by Warner Brothers, The Lost Boys, directed by Joel Schumacher, was a decent success in the US, making $32 million on an $8.5 million budget. A very low budget if you've seen the gloss and unique beauty of the final product. However, it was critically and culturally a much larger hit than the box office numbers would suggest.
Ray, you never need to call me.
Making household names of Kiefer Sutherland, Jamie Gertz, Jason Patric, and of course, the Coreys. The film was just stuffed full of beautiful cinematography, excellent lush production design, a stellar young sexy cast, and a soundtrack that crafted the film's tone perfectly, but also transcended the film to become a cultural molding piece of pop collaboration. In 1985, The Lost Boys was originally conceptualized as more of a Goonies-type film, with the characters being written much younger as kids, and the Frog Brothers actually being Cub Scouts. It wasn't until Joel Schumacher took on the project that he saw it completely different. He felt it was time that a film represented vampires as more fun, sexy, and more importantly, hip. He hated the idea of kids against vampires and said he would never sign on unless he could change the characters into teenagers. I've always felt this was the only route to take for this movie, and thank God Joel saw it the same way. Lost Boys is a classic piece of cinema. In order to achieve this status, he not only had to assemble a truly visionary crew and an up-and-coming young cast, but also enlist the services of someone who knew music inside and out. Entertainment industry veteran Michael Papel acted as music consultant on the film, having consulted on such 80s films as Valley Girl, Plain Clothes, and Real Genius. Prior to joining the film, he ran his own independent marketing promotions company that was founded in 1980, and then in 1990 co-founded Interscope Records. Thomas Newman wrote the original score as an eerie blend of orchestra and organ arrangements. This is, to this day, a very different Thomas Newman. He used used a very intense and sometimes melodic arrangement to step over one another. There are gentle and relaxing beach tone themes that mix with real crashing wave sound effects, and then organs that scream into the film right as tension is being built.
Sam, come back! No way! Sam, come back! Sam, come back! Enough!
His score plays throughout the entire film and gives the action a great sense of scope and stakes. The organ thrusts in and out, like Nick Cave dropping bricks on his organ keys.
Mom, no! Mom!
Now, the release soundtrack consisted of one of Thomas Newman's actual score in order to make room for the film's original rock and pop tracks. However, an extended version came out a few years later on CD, consisting of 2 discs, one of them all Newman's work. It's a really great listen. This score is amazing. There's fun with loud horns and drums for the scenes with the Frog Brothers and the Emersons, all geared up to take on the Bloodsuckers. There's sexy intrigue for the exposition and mysterious moments. And what I feel is the strongest element of the score, the organ and choir combo. Wow, when it hits you, it's amazing and brings the next level to the excitement and scares. Brings the dread up, but keeps it fun. It's been in the conversation among some of the best soundtracks of all time. I would even argue that it paved the way for the major movie soundtrack renaissance of the 1990s. It walked that line of trending, hip, pop bands, major rock bands, and actual original theme songs. And even some oldies but goodies like the Rascals' Groovin', to satirically invoke the illusion of new beginnings and family, the way the movie starts out. But the most notable track on the album has got to be G. Tom Mack's Cry Little Sister.
Joel Schumacher, the director, the great director of Lost Boys, asked me to write a theme song for the film, and I basically read the script and got inspired by it and wrote it, and then it became he wanted it everywhere in the movie, and but obviously we tamed it, we made it work, and there was a lot of incredible synergetic, creativity between Joel and myself as to when and how the music got implemented, my song got implemented into the film. But yeah, I mean, it was one of those bits of magic, really,
And it plays out like magic. So this isn't something where you had to see a finished edit of the film in order to draw inspiration from. You kind of went into it blindly, maybe having only read the script first?
Well, it was the first time at that point, I'd done about probably 14 films, of that period, and the period being the 80s. But they were shooting, so Joel said, can you send you a script and maybe you'll get inspiration from that? And I did. And so I went on to, I remember reading the script one night. I was in New York living there, and then the next day I got up and started banging away at the piano and my guitar, and out comes this melody, and then it morphed itself into me going up to my studio up 6th Avenue and getting there and started to just go away at the lyrics and put it all together.
Because of what happened in the 80s with the rise of sort of I don't want to call it hair metal, but you have a soundtrack. You have a soundtrack that has a significant amount of that, and it also has things like Echo and the Bunnymen and In Excess.
Yeah, right.
Your song stands out on that, and you're probably humble, but it is the song that sort of transcends the album and has been covered over and over and over again. Does that still feel amazing, or did it ever?
I mean, I didn't really know how powerful it was until really things became internet-wise, I mean, I saw my royalties, and I was going, well, this must be doing well, But that really, but that was on a soundtrack. Cry Little Sister was never really released as a single. It was forced to be a single in England because people were just gravitating to it. But it just, a lot of times people didn't even know who did it, because it was just sort of like, it was the theme song. It is the theme song to Lost Boys, but it was just kind of, as an artist, I was kind of lost of like, who did that, until finally everybody caught on.
Aside from creating an amazing sound design, sound editors Larry Caro, Craig Clark, and Louis Edmond, along with music editor Kenneth Carman, really let Cry Little Sister influence moment to moment, as well as cast a giant shadow over the unique visuals and tension that certain moments create. Another great track that helps fill out the album's original 44-minute runtime is Echo and the Bunnymen's cover of The Doors' 1967 song People Are Strange. addition from being performed for the soundtrack, it was also released as a single and peaked at number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. The song was actually produced by the Doors' own original founding member and keyboardist Ray Manzarek. A 12-inch vinyl version was released in February of 1988 before the single was re-released in 1991. Being a musician and music lover himself, when Kiefer Sutherland was first offered the role, he was reluctant to sign on. It took finding out that the set list of bands that Schumacher had lined up to really catch his attention. It's said that his final decision on signing on to the film was finding out that Joel Schumacher had lined up INXS and Jimmy Barnes to form an undisclosed number of tracks for the film. The song they ended up collaborating on was the totally rockin' Good Times, an awesome track that plays twice throughout the film, including the oh so awesome Death by Stereo exploding Billy Worth scene. Now, the infamous track that we all know and love from Tim Capello, I Still Believe, originally performed by The Call, has become ingrained in our brains as we visualize a muscular American gladiator gripping the neck of his saxophone like he's strangling a horse while shaking his purple tights-covered hips. He was a sax player for a lot of Tina Turner's music back in the 80s and 90s, including Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. His musical performance in the film is one for the ages and not to be forgotten anytime soon. A song that didn't appear in the original soundtrack was Run DMC and Steven Tyler's Walk This Way, which played in one of my favorite scenes in the film, the Surf Nazi Massacre scene. Andrew Lloyd Webber was so impressed by Schumacher's use of music in this film, he was immediately interested in hiring him to direct the Phantom of the Opera film that didn't materialize until 2004, which didn't turn out to be very good, but it did introduce the world to Emmy Rossum. Thank you for that. Schumacher's actually had several films in his filmography with wonderful soundtrack arrangements, including the not-so-amazing film Batman Forever, the movie What the Fuck Ever, the soundtrack a staple of 90s pop culture. There's a lot of cool nods to the music acts from the soundtrack in the film itself. You can see a poster of Echo and the Bunnyman behind Michael when he's carrying Star into the Emerson house up the stairs. And of course the gigantic mural of Jim Morrison himself in the badass vampire cave. The Lost Boys is one of my favorite films and my favorite vampire movie ever made. There's something special about watching The Lost Boys. It's beautiful to look at, first of all. It's one of those 80s films that's really stood the test of time despite the 80s fashion and some of the sensibilities. It creates a portrait of Northern California lifestyle and uses that as a fish out of water story. This was Schumacher at his peak, in my opinion, and it's hard to top the experience of viewing this film for the first time as a 9-year-old in the theater and noticing its unique perspective and use of music through the ages. The Lost Boys soundtrack has been one of those very sought out but very difficult to find records. It's been out of print for years. You can go to Discogs. There's a few on there I've seen for around $30 to $35. Check that website to see what condition they're in, obviously, before you order them. The 180-gram audiophile red vinyl released in April 27th of 2018, and it can be found in limited capacity for around $32 at various websites, but recently they've all been out of stock. I'm not sure why this album has gone out of print or become so difficult to find. I will tell you that the original soundtrack released is not the preferable one. You want to find the extended copy with all of Thomas Newman's work on it. Now that one I believe is mostly only on CD, but I don't totally want to go empty-handed with my vinyl recommendation for the week, so as a companion piece, I'm going to go with Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez from Dusk Till Dawn. It's actually a pretty awesome soundtrack.
This thing, it's gonna follow you. It could look like someone you know, or it could be a stranger in a crowd.
Originality these days, at least in cinema, is coming in the form of horror. Sure, there are horror films that don't work, and ones that are just flat out atrocious. It Follows, on the other hand, is a small, modern masterpiece. As a horror fan, it pulls you out of bed, wakes you up, and slaps you across the face, and places you in front of the screen. This film not only helps fight the battle that horror is a proven property, it also allows some much needed breathing room for another true great to come along. It's not often that a film is effective from its creative, unique camera techniques to its spooky and eerie throwback score and sound design that it actually builds a blockade in front of all horror detractors. It Follows premiered at Cannes Film Festival in 2014 on May 17th. It was was given a limited release in the United States on March 13th and a wide release on March 27th. Its sheer effectiveness comes mostly from the atmosphere and the details of this living nightmare. In college, I wrote an essay entitled The Atmosphere of Creepy, centering around the horror greats who established perfect tone and atmosphere to create a world that was frightening from both the visual and mental perspective. Films on this list ranged from The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari to Psycho, Session 9 to Aliens, and Don't Look Now. Films that not only worked narratively, but stayed with you internally due to the abundance of scary and detailed environments, and the way each filmmaker stayed consistent through the film. This is largely due to the unique sound designs and soundtracks. The score of It Follows is very much like an old school 70s or 80s score crafted by the great John Carpenter, with its dark, soft, then rough synth that gives off Halloween or The Fog vibes. When Rich Vierland, the artist known as Disasterpiece, first talked with writer-director David Robert Mitchell, they were going to have 6 months to put this music together. But when the film got into Cannes, their timing was cut into 3 weeks. Because of this short amount of time, director Mitchell put out some temp scores for the team and Rich to listen to for inspiration. Some of those tracks ranged from Assault on Precinct 13 to Halloween. Rich has quoted that having those tracks around was both, quote, a blessing and a curse. The reference material certainly laid down a solid foundation of ideas. Disasterpiece went on to say, I often worked straight from those reference pieces, but it was mostly about tone, getting a sense of what sort of approach works, what style and level of energy. I tried to boil those references down to adjectives and simple ideas, and then rebuild the music back up from the ground as something new and different. The best way to describe It Follows is a living nightmare. The movie is really about an unknown or spiritual entity that's passed along sexually from victim to victim. And this entity does nothing but walk towards you. And the score churns out themes exactly like the movie does, of loss of innocence, grief, sexual identity, and fear of the unknown. All of this is conveyed in Vierland's work. It's a surreal experience to watch what is happening on screen, as it feels like you are there with the characters. The film opens with an ambiguous scene involving a young girl continuing to walk through her neighborhood while appearing to be looking at something that she's scared to death of. The camera work, mixed with the buildup of Disasterpiece score, gives the viewer the feeling of dread and terror, despite not knowing exactly why yet.
What's going on? Annie?
After that, we're introduced to our main character, Jay, played confidently by Mika Monroe, who truly carries the film. It's the way we begin this film that pulls you right in, especially if you're a horror fan of the 80s. It kicks off with Disasterpiece score, full of eerie yet brilliant synth music that sets the tone of the first act. Vierland uses a beautiful original structure of mostly FM with a little additive synth thrown in. FM is short for frequency modulation, and is less sample or natural instruments, and more of an unmistakable digital sound. FM synth has a varying frequency, amplitude, or tone that makes them sound unnatural and complex when compared to simple subtractive synths. Additive synths use sound waves as building blocks stacked on top of each other to create a sound. These are used here perfectly to not confuse the audience with a traditional instrument with its fully unique and blatant digital sound. This gave Vierland the extra control over how far he wanted to take each important moment. You can hear that throughout the long, slow burn build-up sequences, as well as the faster-paced, more intense moments. The whole time we're watching Jay, it's as if she's being watched. from her doing her makeup in her room to swimming in the pool. Those short 3 weeks of recording and creating the sound and feel resulted in both a creepy and engrossing piece of cinematic music. Mitchell and Disasterpiece really wanted to throw the kitchen sink at the final scene, and it shows. This is David Robert Mitchell's first go at horror, having only directed one film in 2010, also based in Detroit. So there's many things about this film to praise, from its simple yet absolutely terrifying premise, to the effectiveness of the storytelling, and also its ability to not only be a frightening experience while viewing it, but also sticking with you after. If you've ever had a nightmare where you felt you're being chased by either a known or unknown entity, where you didn't know why and couldn't do anything to stop it, this is that dream. It even looks like a dream in certain scenes, and with the use of Disasterpiece's score perfectly placed throughout the film, it sounds like a dream as well. David Robert Mitchell, costume designer Kimberly Leitz, and production designer Michael Perry set out to intentionally throw the audience off balance with its multi-era feel. The cars are both old and new. The clothing is definitely otherworldly. All the TV sets are old, standard 4x3 format, and even what's on them is always old science fiction serials. Aside from the character of Yara on a seashell-shaped e-reader, there is literally only one cell phone ever seen in the film in the opening scene, which could be debated is out of context altogether, sort of as a prologue that could be taking place sometime in the future, for it has really nothing to do with the rest of the characters. The entire creative team behind this film set out to make a very out-of-time piece of horror, and Disasterpiece's score is no exception to that. The way the walls of synth drip down each and every cinematic eruption of terror is grand scale and conceptualized in the viewer's brain exactly what is at stake, with something always creeping towards Jay or lingering somewhere on a trajectory straight for her. Verlin wasn't even particularly familiar with Carpenter's work, which is crazy to think about. He just wasn't a horror fan, so it had somehow escaped his view. He read the script early on and was on the fence about it right off the bat, saying that sometimes the script could feel directionless. He was skeptical because he had not seen a screenplay come to life before. Once he met with David, however, he knew the deliberate direction for which he wanted to go with the film and the music alike, and it was ambitious as fuck. And he really believed in the power of synth. Quoting, "It's because synth can create sounds that are not always analogous to real-life sounds. They do a good job of being strange and harder to pinpoint. I think the tendency can ignite the imagination. It's perfect fodder for writing scary music." I love that quote. You can certainly tell these are stylistic choices by Mitchell and Vreeland, and they all work perfectly to create the atmosphere. I think the editing is one of the strongest attributes. It, along with the brilliant sound design, hammer you over the head from start to finish. The camera work has amazing moments where you can tell they're pushing themselves to make the viewer literally feel like they're there the whole time. Telling a new, fresh story full of terrifying and thought-provoking themes that don't feel preachy or manipulative is hard work. It's a horror film that doesn't need to explain itself. Sure, there's moments of exposition, but the brilliant twist here is that they're all from unreliable sources. The film was a critical success and a pretty big financial success, making $21 million worldwide on a $1 million budget. Sounds pretty good to me. The theater-going experience was the true highlight. I honestly cannot remember the last time I was in a theater where there were chills running down my spine the whole time, yet I had a huge smile on my face. The smile was simply because I knew I was watching something great. The movie grabs you and never lets you go. One of my favorite movies of 2015, and probably my favorite horror movie of the last 14 years. I can tell you that the film's title is the honest truth. The feelings of dread, despair, desperation, and fear, they all follow you long after you leave the theater. Sure, one can make the comparisons with Disasterpiece's It Follows score, with a few of John Carpenter's scores, but Verlin's score holds a very classic composition with style, high craft, and naive fear, and it doesn't have to compare to others. A film score is first and foremost designed to envelop the feel and tone of the particular film that it's scoring, and the entire track list of Disasterpiece's record perfectly encapsulates the film for which it's scored. Seriously, I would accredit much of this movie's effective success to this score. Dare I say, Disasterpiece created a masterpiece. I'm going to recommend a vinyl, and if you couldn't guess it, this week I'm going to recommend Disasterpiece's It Follows the Score. This was released February 2nd in 2015. It's roughly about 45 minutes long, consists of 18 tracks, put out in stores by Edition Mylon Music with permission of the Weinstein Company, with a digital booklet.
Thanks for watching, you grommets. Stay tuned to Cinema Gulp for more, and subscribe during the Halloween season. Until next time, we suck, your cinema.